Welcome to another segment of Sage Advice, where me, Greg Tito, talks to Jeremy Crawford. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi there.
We, in this one, talk through some fun D&D mechanics and come up with answers to questions you might have and using them at the table, as well as what the design intent is behind some of them. And for this segment, we are discussing an interesting optional rule presented in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything that allows characters, when they're being created, to customize their origin and basically do, well, I'm not going to say do whatever you want, but maybe that is true. Can players now create their characters of their dreams?
We definitely make it easier to get close to grasping that dream, because the whole point of this origin customization rule is to really let you accentuate the individuality of your character. Some people, when they make a character for D&D, are all about embracing some of the classic archetypes of D&D. You know, I want to play the elfiest elf who ever existed, and so I'm going to just, pick the elf in the player's handbook, pair it with one of the character classes, and I'm good to go. But there are also many D&D players where a part of their thrill in character creation is creating a character who doesn't follow some of the game's classic archetypes. And we already in the game give you a number of choice points when you're making your character. In addition to choosing your character's race and class, you also, of course, get to choose your character's background, where you get a number of knobs that you get to turn and levers to pull to really bring out the distinctiveness of your character. But even with those options, people can still feel constrained, especially by a few of the elements that are in character race. And race is actually the one main choice that we give you in the player's handbook, where we don't actually give you much room for customization. In class, you're usually picking from a list of proficiencies for your skills. You're picking a subclass. In background, you not only have a bunch of backgrounds to choose from, but we even tell you how to customize or your backgrounds or create your own. And so in a way, when we were looking at these three big pillars of character creation, race sort of stuck out like a sore thumb because it doesn't have in the player's handbook those same customization options. And so way back in early 2019, when I was doing the outline for Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, one of the first things in that outline was we need to put in some ability to get under the hood of elf, dwarf, human, what have you, and introduce some customization. Because we know that not only do people want to often play against type, there are other players who are uncomfortable with the implication that maybe all dwarves are alike, and there are others who have a draw toward character optimization, who often feel constrained when they look at the different options and feel like, well, if I'm going to play a rogue, then I need to pick elf or one of the other options that's going to boost my dexterity. There are many players who will look at the ability score increases that are in a number of the race options and feel constrained by them. And we wanted to allow people to lift that sense of feeling constrained, because contrary to what many people might think, those ability score increases that are in those different options, they're not there for game balance purposes. They are there strictly to reinforce the different archetypes that have been in D&D going all the way back to the 70s. Elves have always been extra dexterous. Dwarves have always been very hearty. It really has been just about archetype reinforcement. And because it's not there for game balance reasons, we give people the option in Tasha's Cauldron to take whatever those bonuses are And and there are many different examples I could give, but let's pretend you pick an option that gives you a +2 to intelligence and a +1 to constitution. You could take that +2 and that +1 and put them in any ability score you want. But the rule is clear. You can't put them in the same one. So this is not a way to take a +2 and a +1 and add them together into a +3 and dump them on the same ability score.
Darn it.
Just you can basically take them and assign them another way. This lets you, say, play an elf who, unlike a typical D&D adventurer, is not very dexterous, and might even be a klutzy elf, but is extra charming, and you take that +2 and put it in your elf's charisma. We want people to have that flexibility, particularly because we know under the hood, the game is not relying on those bonuses being applied to particular ability scores when you pick something like dwarf or elf. What our system cares much more about is just simply you have those bonuses worked into your ability scores. It's much less about which ability scores that they are applied to.
Well, that makes sense. So as far as the balance goes, it just means that you're assuming a certain power level from a player character, and as long as those bonuses are applied somewhere within there, then it should necessarily. Everybody can make suboptimal choices, of course, in character creation and beyond. But all things being generally averaged out, as long as you've got a +2 and a +1 to one of the 6 ability scores, you should be fine.
Absolutely. Now, some people might wonder, why didn't we just say, hey, your character has a +2 and a +1 and apply it however you want? Well, it's actually related to something you just said about all of this being about just sort of the underlying power level, because not all of the race options have just a +2 or a +1. For instance, if you pick Mountain Dwarf, you actually get 2 +2s. And the Mountain Dwarf was balanced knowing it got 2 +2s, because some of the options, like if you pick Tiefling, you're, instead of getting 2 +2s, you're getting some spells that you're getting some fire resistance, whereas the Mountain Dwarf was balanced with the knowing, hey, you're unusual in that you are getting 2 +2s. And what the Tasha's Cauldron system lets you do as a Mountain Dwarf is take both of those +2s and put them someplace else. And so that's why we're letting you reassign rather than just sort of having a blanket statement of, everyone just gets a +2 and a +1, because that could then end up resulting in some balance problems. There are even a few race options that don't have a +1; they only have a +2. And so if you're playing one of those options and using the Tasha's customization option with it, well, then you just have a +2 to assign wherever you want. So this is created to interact seamlessly with all of the options that currently exist in the game.
I love that, because it means that it's something that you can use or interact with. If you have a player, I'm thinking as a dungeon master, if you have a player who's like, I really want to do this type of a, let's say a really charismatic dwarf, and you're like, well, now you can, because you'll have that +2, and then you can still have it be hardy or however you want to make that happen. Now, ability scores aren't the only things that are a part of this origin system too, right?
Correct. We also give your character the ability to change which languages you get. For instance, if you pick dwarf, you're told that you know Common and Dwarvish. Well, you might decide, my dwarf grew up among elves. The system gives you explicit permission to say maybe your dwarf knows Elvish instead of Dwarvish. So you have some flexibility there. And then we also give you the ability to swap out any proficiencies that you might have gained. For instance, you might have picked one of the elf options and you were given proficiency in longswords, but you might decide, my elf never learned how to use a longsword. And so we give you a table of different swap options where certain proficiencies can be swapped for different other types of proficiencies. And that includes, so if you know a weapon proficiency, you might swap that for another weapon or for a tool. So you might decide that your elf, rather than having proficiency in the longsword, has proficiency with lutes because you were a musician. And when your siblings were off learning, how to wield these archetypal elf weapons, you were at your music lessons. So that, again, that gives you some nice flexibility for customizing your character while retaining the ability for people who want it to just go with the archetype. I mean, that's the other thing that I think it's important to state is this doesn't take anything away. This is just adding some customization ability for people who want it. If there's a group that has no interest with this, they just want to pick an option from the player's handbook and go, you can still do that. But again, if you want to get under the hood with your character and make some of these simple adjustments, simple but potentially very impactful, we give you a very straightforward way to do that.
That makes sense. Getting back to like the kind of history and philosophy behind this change, and listening to you, I started to think about, in some ways, humans as a playable race in D&D were the versatility option, right? Like they were like, if you wanted to play any type of archetype, you could do so by playing as a human, right? And it's still in our 5th edition rules where you can assign those or do the +1 all across the board, depending on how you wanted to go. And that has basically been true since 1st edition, right? Where if humans could do anything, that elves and dwarves could do, potentially even better. But like if you wanted to do, and maybe this is what I'm asking is like, was the philosophy that like dwarves and elves were supposed to be less desirable, like because you had to play in this archetype, back in earlier editions, and then now we're finally sweeping away those vestiges?
Yeah, a big part of it in the old days is that elves and dwarves and some of the other playable options were very much the product of folklore. And in folklore, elves and dwarves are, I often refer to them as embodied metaphor. They were metaphors for different aspects of the human psyche. So, elves were often associated with more elevated, lofty aspects of the human psyche. Dwarves were often associated with the industriousness that some people manifest. And as so often happens in fairy tales, these figures, they're given form, because in fairy tales, rather than metaphors just being sort of an airy thing that we talk about, you can meet metaphors. You can meet a demon, which is embodied evil. You can meet an angel that is embodied good. You can meet a dwarf who is sort of the embodiment of industriousness and hardiness. And that's really where that originally came from. But then when you take that sort of storytelling element and you marry it with game design, it's like 1st edition D&D, in a way trying to protect the human's turf. Well, the human turf was about maximum flexibility. And with the dwarf and the elf, and the other options as well, it was much more about you have fewer options, but you might be very good at those options. So in a way, it was about specialization. I should also point out, because it's possible not everyone knows this, but in the earliest days of D&D, elf and dwarf were classes, because in the original version of the game, race was not even a thing. You just picked your character's class, which might be magic user, fighter, elf, and so later in advanced D&D, when elf and dwarf were turned into options as well as human that could then be paired with class options, I think, in trying to find out like what in the game design wise, what is the turf of these different game objects? Well, the sort of the turf staked out for humans was flexibility. They could do a little bit of everything. Because also what many people might not know is way back then, there were also class limits. Humans could be any class. That wasn't true for non-humans. Their
Yeah.
class options were also limited. But as the game has evolved over the last, half century, we have increased with each edition the flexibility so that now every race option can be every class option. Uh, Races used to, in addition to having bonuses, also had penalties. Now all of the races in the player's handbook just have bonuses. But even that, the message to us has felt limiting to people because, the thinking in the past was, well, we'll just create upside. Well, it makes sense though in a game when you want your character to be the best as something, that upside can again feel constraining. And that's why we want to give people the ability to change it. Also, something that people might not be aware of in terms of a philosophical change over time in D&D is in previous editions, especially first, second, and third edition, these characteristics associated with dwarves, elves, humans, and others, they were assumed to ripple through every member of that particular people. That is not an assumption in the design of fifth edition. And we make that very clear in the fifth edition monster manual. If you go to the NPC appendix, where you find commoner, priest, cultist, archmage, we tell you right in the introductory material, those NPCs represent people of any race. We tell you it's completely optional to apply the racial traits that are in the player's handbook race write-ups to those NPCs. In other words, it is not our assumption, and never has been in fifth edition, that those bonuses that are in the player's handbook racial traits are true of every member of the race. They are specifically there just to reinforce the sort of traditional D&D archetypes for dwarf adventurers, elf adventurers, halfling adventurers, and so on. But as the game continues to evolve, we've seen that, and also as the different types of characters that people make proliferates and becomes wonderfully diverse, as people create types of characters that many of us would never imagine, that it's time for a bit more of those old assumptions to, if not pass away, at least be something that a person can set aside if it's not of interest for them and their character. And it's with that in mind that we created this system to basically really be true to our philosophy that we sometimes talk about when we give DMing advice, and that is whenever possible, say yes. Yes. And so this is a system about saying yes to players, that yes, you can play the dwarf you want to play. You can play the elf you want to play. You can play the halfling you want to play. We even go a step further in Tasha's Cauldron. We have a sidebar where we allow you to create something we call a custom lineage, where if you want, when you create your character, you can decide not to pick a race at all. You can decide that your character comes from a lineage all their own, that, as a result, perhaps of your ancestry, or maybe magic or some divine descent, you have a group of characteristics that none of the game's races actually represent. And so we give you a little toolkit for selecting your character's traits to represent this custom lineage. It's similar in some ways to the variant human in the player's handbook, which was a little sort of toolkit for creating a custom character. But this goes just a little further in allowing you to create the character you want, who might, maybe you decide your character was born in the Feywild and just has some mysterious collection of abilities. Well, using the custom lineage, we let you give yourself +2 to an ability score of your choice. Pick a feat. You decide if you have dark vision or proficiency in a skill of your choice. And so you see, with with options like these, you can create pretty much any character you would want.
That's the dream, right? I mean, it's what we say in a lot of our marketing materials is you get to play as your whatever your fantasy tells you. And I think this system really does, kind of complete that circle. Finally, it's interesting. Again, listening to you talk about this is that it's been a long time since I've sat down at a D&D table and there was, you know, four humans and a dwarf, or two elves and a halfling and three humans, right? Like it is because of all of the amazing, racial and subclass options that are now available in fifth edition. Like, of course, people want to do a tabaxi and a tiefling and a something even more fanciful that the dungeon master has made up and brought to the table. And I think embracing that at this point is really important, because what we've learned is that people want to express themselves in whatever speaks to them, and this now kind of sweeps away, like I said, all of the oldest assumptions that we had about how to play this game, and allows anybody to tinker and fulfill the fantasy that they want to fulfill at the table.
Absolutely. That openness is very much a part of how we see the future ahead of us, in terms of where we're going with the game, of really encouraging this kind of flexibility, so that people never feel restricted in unpleasant or uninteresting ways. And I put it that way because some amount of restriction is actually interesting in games. All games are about making choices and
Yeah.
making meaningful choices. But we want the choices to be between things that are all fun and interesting. Like a great example is making the choice between the classes, where it's an open-ended field and you get to just choose whatever one sings to you. What we don't want is choice where hiding inside it is some kind of trap. And that's what the traditional ability score bonuses often feel like for some people, of like, well, I wanted to play a halfling, but not quite like this.
Right.
And so that is what, again, this option is meant to address, is get that bit of friction out of there, so that you can still play the character you want to play. You might want to play a dragonborn because you want to, breathe fire, and that's still there, but you want to tweak that ability score bonus. You want to change the languages,
Yeah.
and just those little tweaks can make your character feel very different from another dragonborn.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could even imagine this system being used. I'll give an example of a homebrew setting that I'm running right now, where I restricted the race choices to kind of the basics of gnome, elf, and dwarf. Mostly just because I was like, I have a specific story I want to tell. I don't want to necessarily have to figure out how to Aarakocra fit into this, or and have that be taken away from me as a storyteller. And I wanted to get kind of buy-in from the things to do, and that's always an option. You can always do that.
Mm-hmm.
But something that's interesting about this is that people can choose perhaps some of the archetypes that they like about elves and dragonborn, and play as a character that just has some of those parts of it included within it. Whether they are, whatever you call the race doesn't necessarily matter. It could just be like, oh, this is the type of archetype that I want to play, and it's just another people. Maybe even and then all of a sudden it becomes a jumping off point for creating, a new fantasy people with a player and a dungeon master collaborating together.
Yeah, yeah. Which I always love seeing, because as soon as you realize we're telling stories in a multiverse where gods are always getting up to trouble, or doing wonderful things, and there's powerful magic and ancient creatures and wondrous locations, I think people would find it's like there's an infinite number of peoples out there, and also truly unique individuals,
Yeah.
because of the work of magic and the gods and the different planes. Who says the person you meet is a part of a people as we would understand it in our world. They might be a one of a kind. Maybe like I think of like Wonder Woman, who is crafted with clay. In some of the old comics, by the gods. Well, maybe that's true of your character. Maybe there aren't any others.
And you don't have to be restricted to a +2 to Constitution for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well,
exactly.
that all is very exciting. I'm sure there'll be more questions that will arise from working with this origin system. But there seems to be a trend with all of the topics we've been discussing around Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which is that it really is giving all of the options to both players and dungeon masters. And I think that's something that everybody can get behind.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to seeing how groups use the many different options in the book in ways that we never imagined. And that for me will be the special joy in the next year or two, is to see how people take this stuff and then run with it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeremy. If people want to interact with you on Twitter, how would they possibly do that?
I can be found on Twitter at Jeremy E. Crawford.
Excellent. And I can't wait for Tasha's Cauldron of Everything to come out November 17th. It'll be in everyone's hands. There's an awesome alternate cover available only through game stores, so make sure and make your pre-orders there, and it will be very exciting.
I can't wait.
Thanks, Jeremy.